So before I start work on the hydraulics, we need to slacken the bleed screw on the regulator. Now I'm using a stubby 12mm, it's always a 12mm hex head. Stubby because it's awkward and you can't really get a larger spanner in. And I have to slide my arm down, in this case between the dynamo, and I have a torch here shining on the aforementioned bleed nut. And I'm slacking off just half a turn. And that's all we need to do. It takes the pressure off, and now we can work on the hydraulics and take off the LHS pump. So I'm now going to talk about removing the LHS, in this case LHS pump, hydraulic pump. This being an early car, it runs on LHS, which is not very nice stuff. It takes paint off and what have you. This pump, the pump is leaking from its main seal and it's been dribbling down onto the disc and everything, and it's best if you can catch this as soon as possible because it makes a right old mess. So this being a semi-automatic car, as you can see we have the centrifugal regulator up here, so I'm going to try and leave the centrifugal regulator in place, but I've still got to take off the belt and all of this bracketry in order to pull the pump out from this side. I've already released the pressure on the regulator on the other side of the car, so we don't have high pressure coming out of the pump, so I'll just get tore into it. Being an early car, this has got a combination of 11mm and 12mm head nuts and bolts. It's always useful to have tubs to hand to put your nuts and bolts in, so they don't all get sprayed all over the workshop or all over the car, come to that. I've also got a tray underneath the car which is going to catch either dripping LHS or the few nuts and bolts and the odd spanner that I'm undoubtedly going to drop. Good idea to do that, of course, because when you're working on something other than a nice solid surface like grass, things tend to get lost. So if you can put a cloth down, or as I've got here, a container, it makes your life easier. So here we have, this is the adjusting bracket for the tension on the belt for the centrifugal regulator, and all of these have, including the alternator and the LHS pump, have these little square washers which fit inside the adjusting bracket and allow you to slide the bolt up and down, allow you to slide the bolt in order to get the tension. So these are easily lost, so please keep hold of them. This particular pump has had a broken off stud, and so a bolt has been fitted, so you won't find this on your car. This has been an interim fix, which of course is going to be repaired when we change the pump anyway, which is why I'm struggling to get the bolt out. There we go. Now that should allow me to get enough slack on the belt to take it off. But I want to leave that in place, but these pipes may get in the way. We'll see how we go. So I'm now going to remove the adjusting bracket for the hydraulic pump, which is slightly hidden from view for you by the centrifugal regulator. This has got a nail-up nut in it, non-standard, but a perfectly good replacement. Once again, we have the square washers and an additional washer. The nut at the other end is, of course, a different size because it's a citron. And once again, the third square washer. So I'm now going to slacken off the main pivot fixing bolt for the pump, which is down here, and it goes right through the casing, and it's secured with a lock nut on the back side, and it's right next to the outlet pipe. Now it is particularly awkward, particularly on semi-automatic cars which have got 3 pulleys. So what I've got here is just a socket, one socket on a ratchet, and it's just the right depth to be able to get onto the nut. You see there's very little clearance to the steering rack, so you have to sort of choose your tool to do this job. So I've just cracked it off. You should be able to just hold the nut on the other side, or even in this case I can spin it off with my fingers. But I'm not going to take it out just now. I just want to slacken it off, because this then allows me to pivot the pump, and I can then take the belts off. So now the pump should pivot, which it does, gives me a little bit of slack, and I just work the belts off the pulleys one at a time. There we go. And now the pump will pivot back. I will also slacken off the pipe union, which is 12mm. And at some point this has got to come off, and you will be dribbling some LHS or hydraulic fluid if you're LHM. And also you want to look out for the seal, which may jam in the housing or it may come out on the pipe. Don't know yet. It's one of the excitements of working as a mechanic. You can just, there you are, finish it off by just wiggling the pump, and the union should undo. Now this also allows me access to get to the filler pipe clamp, which once again is a little awkward. Well, I can just see it. Now, this is where we're really starting to going to make a mess. So I'll get a cloth and put it behind the pump. And the idea is that as I pull the pipe off the top of the pump, it will dribble some fluid out, if I can get it to start. Technique of using a screwdriver as a lever, highly recommended. Here we go. So as it comes off the top, I'm going to try and put my thumb over it to stop it leaking too much. There we go. And then lift it up as quickly as possible so that the fluid in the pipe drains back into the reservoir. And as you can see, I've made a little bit of a mess. So immediately wipe, if it's LHS in particular, immediately wipe it down, and ideally wash it with water, soap and water. Tuck that pipe out of the way for the time being. So the pump is almost completely free. Just need to take off the pressure pipe. It might not come right out at this point in time. And the pivot bolt, which will slide out again, but you might not be able to get it completely out because it's very close to the steering rack, as you see. And it's actually hitting the steering rack, and I can't actually pull the bolt all the way out. So you now got to lift the whole pump up slightly. You can then get the bolt out and then wiggle the pipe off the bottom. So there's the pump completely free, and I can just wiggle it out past these pipes, and there is the pump off. So here we are. I've just cleaned up the area with a little bit of brake cleaner, and I'm now going to offer in the new pump. I've just got to wiggle it around the pipes. Now I'm just going to rest it here shortly, so to show you that we need the right seal. Now this lovely part here, pièce d'origine Citroën, is the original, it's a new old stock original part, and as you probably know, you don't want to mix up the seals from LHM and LHS. So this one, being the original Citroën one, is actually red, which denotes that it is an LHS part rather than an LHM. So the trick here is to do three things at once. Is to slip the seal onto the end of the pipe, just up to the swage, and then offer the pipe in, but don't do any up at all. Then the next bit is we've got to put in the bolt. So I'm holding the pump up at a slight angle so that I can get the bolt in over the top of the steering rack. It's all a little bit tricky and fiddly. I need to angle it a bit more. There we go. And then feed the bolt into the casing. There we are. And now see if we can work the pump, the outlet pipe, into its slot. And it's a little bit awkward, A, because it's got a new seal, and B, because it's not quite the right angle. I don't think that's quite right yet. I'm trying to push it in, but it's not wanting to go. I don't quite know what the problem is. You'll know when it goes in because it suddenly goes clunk. So this pipe is being particularly awkward to go into its correct socket. So the trick I'm going to use now is actually to take the bolt out again, just leave it there, and now I can angle the pump relative to the pipe, and all of a sudden it pops into place. So then it's just a question of tightening up the collar on the pipe, and now I can put the bolt back in to the mounting hole, work it in, and then put the lock nut on the back, which on these cars is 16mm AF compared to the 14mm AF bolt at the front. And we'll just nip that up hand tight for the time being. Okay, now the next bit is to put the pipe on, the supply pipe. So this may involve a bit of dribblage, so it's always a good idea to have a cloth handy. So I'm putting the clamp on in the right orientation, working the pipe down and getting it onto the spigot. There we go. Leaving me with the clamp. Change the direction of rotation of the screwdriver. In fact, I'm going to change the position of the screwdriver altogether. I'm going to do it out here because it makes it easier. Here we go, that's the pipe on. Okay, we've now got to put the belts on, and you have to put the inner one on first, obviously, otherwise you end up all crossed over. So I think I've got it right. We'll soon see. One at a time, just work it over. And the second one. There we go. And you should be able to feel the tension, just to make sure they're even top and bottom. Okay, that'll do for the time being. Now I need to put on the bracket at the top. So here's the tensioning bracket. It goes onto the one of the water pump bolts at the top and onto the mounting bracket on the pump. We then have square washer, and I picked the wrong one because of course they're different sizes. The bolt on the pump is M8 and the bolt on the, sorry, let's try that again. They're both pumps. The mounting bolt on the water pump is M8 and the bolt on the hydraulic pump is M7. Again, square washer, and I'm putting a plain washer. You can, if you're worried about security, put on a lock washer, or you could even put on, like this one's got, a nylock nut, which is non-standard, but as I said, perfectly acceptable upgrade. Okay, just to set the tensions on the belts, I'm just pulling on the back of the spigot here and just feeling the tension on the belts. They want to be reasonably tight, difficult to define reasonably, but essentially as tight as you can pull is probably enough, because you probably can't over tighten them that much. I wouldn't necessarily put a lever behind the pump and try and lever the tension that way. So if you do up this adjuster one here first, and then you can check the tension. So there's a little bit of play there, but that's absolutely fine. Essentially, ideally on all V-belts, you want them running as slack as possible, but consistent with them not slipping. If you've got belts that make a noise, they screech, then it's slightly too slack. So that's the front one done. Then I'll need to tighten up the rear bolt on the adjuster. This one's got a lock washer on it. There we go. And now we can do the pipe union, which again is easy to forget. This doesn't have to be, again, doesn't have to be too tight. Remember, you're crushing a rubber seal, so you don't need to have it super tight. But again, just so it's snug, and then a little bit more. Okay, and then finally, with a socket, you're tightening up the pivot bolt. And I'm able to hold the lock nut on the back here by hand, and I can feel it's not spinning. But if it does spin, you will need a 16mm. I've got a little stubby here. 16mm on early cars, later ones were 14, just to hold the lock nut in place while you nip that up. And that's the pump mounted. Now we've just got to put all the ancillaries back on. Okay, next thing to do is to put the belt for the CR, the centrifugal regulator, on. So work that on, there we go. Now it's roughly sprung into place because of its mounting, but I now need to put the bracket on. Now this bracket's got a rubber mount at the top, which is part of its design, but it needs to slip over the adjuster and drop the washer. It's got to be done really. And we have a long through bolt. I don't think I need that washer on that one. I'm quite happy to drop it. We've got one clamp there. And this one was done up. This is slightly Heath Robinson affair, in that we've got two clamps going onto the same bolt, but you can put the lock nut on first, This one's slightly longer bolt than standard, probably non-standard. And then we have the bottom one, which first of all should have, and does have, the famous square washer. Then we have a plain washer, and then a nut. And now I'm going to tension this belt. Now it can run extremely slack because it's just turning something very light, which is the bob weights in here. It doesn't have to be tight at all, but you want to get it so that it doesn't actually slip. So by holding that up and getting things out of the way so I can actually get at the nut, nip up the lock nut. There we go. Now the next one is to slide on these clamps for the pipes. This one's going to be slightly awkward because the bolt is much longer than the one that came off. Okay, so I'm just going to put extra nuts on these bolts. This is purely really for cosmetic reasons, just to make it look pretty, to have these pipes coming down parallel. You could either put just spacers on, or you could not bother doing it, but this is how we're going to do it with this car. And there we go, all the pipes secure, job's complete. Now I've got the new pump fitted, we now have to bleed the circuit to make sure there's no air in the system. And to do that, we'll have to fire the engine up with the bleed screw open on the regulator and allow the fluid to circulate from the pump to the reservoir for about 2 or 3 minutes until there's no more air bubbles coming out of it. Right, so I've now started up the car. The regulator bleed screw is still open and the new pump is fitted. So what's happening is the pump is sucking up fluid and it's just recirculating it back into the reservoir, which will get rid of all the air in the system, and which is what we're trying to do. So I've got the top off the reservoir and I'm looking in here just to watch for bubbles. And I'll rev it up slightly. Here we go. Lots of air's coming out. It is possible that if you fit a completely dry pump, you might have to prime it, which would mean taking off out the filter and pouring hydraulic fluid into the pump direct to get it to start the pump. But generally they self-prime. So this is producing a lot of bubbles in there, and we'll leave that idling for about 2 or 3 minutes just to make sure all of the air is out of the system before we shut the valve on the regulator. So we've now been running the car for a few minutes and the fluid is now coming through clear in the reservoir. So we can now put the cap back on, shut the valve on the regulator, which is only half a turn open anyway. Here we go. You can hear the pump working. And the car should now pump itself up. We'll give it a bit of assistance. there we go.